This is going to be a real quick edit episode to show how we can take advantage of some of Adobe's new AI features so that we can take a single exposure of this underexposed house taken from a drone and turn it into this, and it's going to be free of noise. This is easy enough to do if you have the right versions of Lightroom Classic and Photoshop, and you want to make sure that you're using at least version 12.3 of Lightroom Classic, and Photoshop 24.4.1 is best. Most of this will be done though in Lightroom Classic with some blending that we'll do in Photoshop. So let's get started. So here is our finished image that we'll have, but we're going to start with this image here, which is very underexposed. And this is very typical shot from a drone where it's moving quite a bit. It's harder to then get brackets to really align well to do exposure blending. So best thing in this case, expose for the sky, expose for the ground, and then we'll worry about bringing out the rest of this underexposed area now that we have the ability to do some stuff with AI. Now, normally, if we wanted to bring the exposure up, and let's say that we wanted to make a copy of this, if we zoom in here and just up the exposure by, let's say, 1.5 stops, that would be just about where we'd want to have our exposure for the outside here. And you can see it's very noisy. There's a lot of grain and color noise that's going on here. Now, there's always been denoise features, but nowadays there's an AI feature in Lightroom Classic to make this happen. We're going to use that, but we're going to then use it to start blending this image and have something very impactful. So let's start from the beginning. Let's take it where we were by taking the exposure down to 0. Once again, nothing's been changed yet. The next thing is to create a virtual copy. And you do that by right-clicking on the image and then say Create Virtual Copy. Now with this copy, then we increase our exposure. So we'll go back to increase that by 1.5 stops. So far, so good. But once again, this is where we have a lot of noise in the image from increasing that exposure. So the next thing you want to do is apply that AI denoise effect. Now this will only work on RAW files and DNG files. Don't try to use this on a JPEG. So it's down in the detail pane and it's just a little button denoise. If this is grayed out or it's not available, it doesn't show, that means you're probably not using the right version of Lightroom Classic, which once again should be at least 12.3, or you're trying to use this on an unsupported image such as a JPEG or a TIFF. Right now this is only on RAW files that have used Bayer techniques off their sensors. Anyways, with that selected, you just click denoise. Now this will take a little while to do once it gets started, but you'll see a preview first. And in the preview, you can scroll down, we'll go down to where the noise is. And you can see as I'm scrolling and moving, you can see all that color noise and other noise that's in there. Once I release it, then you can see how that noise is going to go away. Now I have the denoise amount set to 100 because this was very noisy, but you can adjust it as you need to. If we go up here too and take a look at, for instance, if we even wanted to denoise some of this other area in here like the palm trees, you can see that it's really not going to affect the color. We'll see more of that later. Anyways, after we've selected this at 100%, which is what I would prefer for something like this, you can lower it if you feel you need to, you just click Enhance here. Now that's going to take a few minutes, so I'll cut the video, but before I do, you'll see the progress on two areas. One, it'll be spinning a little wheel down here, and also up here you'll see that progress bar moving ahead. Now that it's done, what it's done is made a new DNG image. And you can see that the name has changed here. So that's now called Enhanced NR-2. This was our original, and this was then the enhanced one. It doesn't look like much right now until we zoom in. When we zoom in 100%, then we can see this enhanced image with the noise reduction is much cleaner than if we were to select the one where we had just upped the exposure and did nothing else. We'll take a closer look at that by then taking all three of these images and loading those as layers into Photoshop. So what you can do is you would go up to, and this would be normal for any of the blending, any of the exposure blending, any of the flambient blending, all of the stuff, by the way, that I show in my courses on real estate photography. If you're not familiar with that, or my books, I have links to that down in the description for this video. Anyways, what you can do is you would go to the photo menu, you would go to edit in, and then open as layers in Photoshop. And by the way, this latest version of Lightroom Classic is missing the accelerator key on open as layers in Photoshop in this sub menu. Normally that open would have been underlined with an O, but instead that's missing. So now those accelerators are gone. So you do have to either select it from the menu or use your arrow keys. Anyways, let's open these as layers in Photoshop. So what we have here in the layer stack is our enhanced image on the top. That's the one that we increased the exposure and then denoised. I left the other one at the bottom so that we can do some comparison when we're done. The layer below that then was the original exposure, which is taking care of all of the ground and the sky. So with this, there's some other AI that you could use to then mask in the house. In this case, it won't work as well, but I want to show you what that would be, because in some cases it will work. Here it won't. And that would be, instead of using standard quick selection, in here, if you press and hold that down, there is object selection. So if you did object selection, it's going to figure out the different areas of the image. And you can see as I mouse over here, it selected the whole house. But you'll know that the house here, the roof is very overexposed. Let's get rid of this, go back to regular quick selection. So all I want to do is select the shaded areas, and that's easy enough to do if you take the selection tool and make it just about the size of where the shadowed areas are. This is a type of AI that's been in Photoshop for a long time to know where boundaries would lie. If you had this very small, then it's not going to expand its outward view to try to find a selection. So you make it a little bit larger to fit within shadow. Then when you press the key, you can see how it's selected those nice edges. So we'll select this first around these shadows, maybe also pick up those shadowed areas, make sure we pick those windows. And then what you can do is just press this little button down here, which will add a mask for that. Now, so far so good, that's coming in, but we need to then select the rest of the shadowed areas. So we'll go down here and we'll select the bottom here, and we'll just add that to that mask. So we'll select around here, and once again, keep that quick selection tool just about the size of top to bottom to where those shadows are, and you should be good, and it should select it fairly well. Okay, now we're fairly close. Let's zoom out, and all that you need to do is, with the mask selected, press Alt-Delete. There, now that came through. Now you can take a brush and use about a 30% flow, and you can brush in then other areas that you want to then brighten, because we're using that brighten exposure. So we can go over here like that. This is the brighten exposure that once again we did the denoise on. And you can see how well it looks by turning it off and on, and if we're getting the areas that we want. So that's looking pretty good, and you can do this to your heart's content however you want to fill that in. You don't have to worry about, in this case, another exposure that you would have bracketed and having blur from, for instance, tree branches or leaves moving. In this case, it was the exact same exposure. Now, let's zoom in here quite a bit. Let's zoom in 100%. In fact, let's go in even a little bit more. And still, we don't see any noise in this area that we edited in. If we were to go back to our original image that we increased the exposure, you can see how much noise and grain is in that image. But when we used that AI enhanced noise reduction image, it's very smooth, yet it's very sharp. So we have a very good image. So once again, everything's fitting in there very well to do that. Next, what we should do is enhance this. This hasn't been edited. This is pretty much just raw. Now, we could flatten this, save it as a Photoshop file, and go back into Lightroom Classic, but let's stay here for a little bit so that we can do that edit, and we can do it in Camera Raw filter, and then a couple more things. So something I like to do that I've talked about in my expert editing course is I like to stamp these layers. And you can do that by being at the top and going Control-Alt-Shift-E. Now you can see I've got one single layer up here. I could shut off all the other layers. It's a combination of everything we just made. Now I can take that and use Adobe Camera Raw, which is basically Lightroom to a large degree, and make some of these adjustments and then keep going further. So we'll go up to the filter menu and we'll select Camera Raw Filter. And of course, if you've never used this before, this is a lot like Lightroom Classic. What we'll do here then is I can apply a preset, and this is very simple. It's a typical one that I start with, and if you want to stop and write this down, this is all that it is. It's just taking the contrast up barely, just by 5, highlights down about 44, shadows up 42, whites 44, blacks -8. You can see a little bit of clarity and then a little bit of vibrance and saturation, but these are just starting points. Since we increase the exposure so much, we don't need to worry about the highlights. We can really reduce those, and also some of the whites. We might want to bring up the shadows just a little bit because of where the sun was being placed, and maybe also just a little bit of saturation in there. So you can make those final tweaks however you'd like, then just press, when you're ready, OK. Now that that's there, you can see the difference. If we were to then, before we did those adjustments, and then after. So if you like this type of exposure, that's good. Once again, this would be up to you on your final adjustments. Now we still have a couple things that are just a little annoying down here, and this is very typical if you're shooting drone. You just can't help but get things in the picture. There was some plastic that was down here, a little something there. So once again, we can use some of the AI tools to get rid of this plastic. We can go to the Object Selection tool here, and with that, make sure lasso is selected, and then you can draw a lasso around, for instance, this plastic area, and it'll detect just that plastic. Now, we can content-aware fill that very easily, but we need to expand a little bit. So you want to go up to the Select menu, and you want to go to Modify, and then expand that selection just slightly, maybe by about, let's say, 2 pixels. Now with that selected, then we can do a content-aware fill. So we can go to Edit, and then we can go down to Fill, and make sure that the contents is selected as content-aware, and select OK. And that did a pretty good job of filling that in. You can do Control-D to deselect it, and if you wanted to touch that up more, you could do some cloning. And over here, this little bit of plastic that was left on the air conditioners, you can see this is a big house. This is a big estate house we did. And it has that little plastic on that one air conditioner unit. We can just use the spot healing brush for that. So that's that spot healing brush here. And we'll just take a little bit, we'll just brush right over that, and it should take care of it. Good enough. Okay, zoom back out here, and you can see that what we started with was a very dark exposure. We did increase the exposure, but we had a lot of noise. So what we did was we made an increased exposure layer using the AI Denoise feature, and then masked that in. Stamping all those layers together, we were able to do some enhancements using Adobe Camera Raw Filter, and then be able to delete a few things using some of the AI that's in Photoshop, and also some of the traditional tools.